What secrets lie beneath the roar of the crowd of the NFL championship game of 1955? Join us as we sit down with renowned historian Robert Cohen to unearth the fascinating stories, the pivotal moments, and the surprising twist of the unforgettable 1955 NFL season and championship game. Get ready for a deep dive into football history that you'll find nowhere else. It's all coming up with Robert in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of PigskinDispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history, and welcome to another edition of our championship series, the National Football League Championships before the Super Bowl. We're going from 1933 all the way to 1965, and we are really getting there now. We are in the 1955 season, 10 years after World War II. Things are going great. The NFL has survived a rival league and getting ready to face another one here in a few years. But we have a dominant team in the 1950s, a couple of them, but one of them shows up here in 1955. We have, as always, an expert on the team that won the championship joining us tonight. His name is Robert W. Cohen. He has wrote a book on the 50 greatest Cleveland Browns, and that definitely gives him the criteria to talk about this era, because I will bet you in those 50, there's quite a few from this 1955 team, and Bob will help us out tonight. Bob Cohen, welcome to the Pig Pen.
Hi, Darren. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, Bob, it is such a pleasure to have you here with your expertise, and I'm sure you've done so much research on this Browns franchise to get these 50 gentlemen that you wrote in your book. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background and maybe some of the other works that you have.
Sure. I began writing professionally about a little over 20 years ago, and I've written about more than 30 books since then. Most of them are actually part of my 50 greatest series of books, where I've looked at some of the most iconic franchises in the history of professional sports, and I've listed their 50 greatest players and provided biographical, statistical, and anecdotal information about each player. And the Browns were one of my more recent ones I did a few years ago, and they certainly have a storied history. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do one about them.
Yeah, most definitely. Why don't you give us the title of this Browns book, and we'll talk about some of the other books here later in the podcast and where people can buy the Browns book.
Sure. The exact title is The 50 Greatest Players in Cleveland Browns History, and it's available on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. Probably have to order it from a bookstore individually, because it's probably not in bookstores anymore at this point.
Okay. And folks, if you're driving or don't have a way to write that down right now, don't worry. We're going to put those links to get to Bob's book in the show notes of the podcast and on the YouTube channel. And you can go to our website, pigskindispatch.com, for this 1955 Cleveland Browns National Football League Championship Series. So Bob, why don't we get into talking about the 55 Browns and maybe the 50 Browns? How are this team structured to be such a dynamic, dominant force in the National Football League?
Well, the Browns came into existence in 1946 after Paul Brown left the military, and he formed the Browns in the short-lived All-American Football Conference. So the Browns spent the first 4 years of the existence in that conference, and they won 4 straight league championships. By far the most dominant team in the conference. I think they lost a total of only 4 games over the course of those 4 seasons, 4 or 5 games.
Yeah, that's dominant.
And then when the league folded at the end of 1949, the NFL absorbed them, and they won the NFL championship their first year in the league in 1950. They lost in the NFL championship game the next 3 years, and they won again in 54 and 55. So in the first 10 years of their existence, the Browns won 10 division titles and 7 league championships. And aside from Paul Brown, the one constant they had all those years was the quarterbacking of Otto Graham, who was considered to be one of the greatest winners in the history of professional sports. He led them to all those titles, and he earned 6 league MVP awards in the process.
Yeah, that is definitely a dominant performance by not only what Paul Brown assembled, but to carry that on. I was talking to one of my guests recently, and I mean, this is an amazing fact. If you count the Cleveland Rams in 1945 and count the AAFC games of the Browns, the city of Cleveland in professional football had a team in the championship game, either winning or losing it, for like 11 straight years, both through the AAFC and the National Football League between the Rams and the Browns. That's blows me away. And some of those games were the Browns against the Rams when they moved
Right.
to LA. Amazing what that city got to experience during that decade.
Yeah, and Paul Brown was one of the first major geniuses of football. He was the first coach to do player profiles, to do the IQ test, personality tests, to call in plays for his quarterback, and really the first head coach in the National Football League to sign black players, make a strong effort towards doing that. And that was one of the things that allowed them to be so dominant.
Yeah, most definitely some great athletes, like what Marion Motley and Bill Willis are the first two that he brought in, but so many more really opened up the door for some of the young athletes of color that are with us today that we get to enjoy on Sundays and Monday nights and I guess every day of the week now with the National Football League and the UFL and everything. But yeah, Paul Brown was definitely instrumental in helping that to occur.
Yeah, and in addition to Motley and Bill Willis, prior to the arrival of Jim Brown, probably the greatest of them all was Len Ford, who was a member of the 1955 team. He was the first great pass rusher, a great defensive end. And he's bigger than most of the players for there. He was about 6'4" and 265 pounds, which was huge for that day. And he was just phenomenal. And he was really the dominant force, one of the most dominant forces on those teams.
Yeah, and just like the Browns of today, when you have a dominant pass rusher, it definitely helps your defense. It lets your defense do a lot more things to confuse the offense when you got to worry about one guy, especially, and you got to throw your double teams and your protections that way. And I'm sure Len Ford was very similar to Mr. Miles Garrett in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I mean, the landscape of the NFL in 1955, this is kind of interesting because we have 12 teams in the National Football League in 1955, broke up into two divisions. They went back to the East and West. They've had some crazy names over the last few years. They're changing them all the time. But the Browns are in the East division now. They've a long time been in the West. And the Browns are with the Redskins, Giants, Cardinals, Eagles, and Steelers. And over in the West is the Rams, Bears, Packers, Colts, 49ers, and the Lions. And in 1955, it's kind of odd, but after so many good years of the Detroit Lions, the Lions are the cellar dwellers at 3-9 in the West. They finished in last place in the West, and the Rams and the Bears fought it out for the top of the West. Rams finishing with an 8-3-1 record. The Bears were 8-4, and in the East, the Browns were 9-2-1, and the beat out the Redskins by a couple games who were 8-4. Giants were 6-5-1, the only other team over 500 in there. So kind of interesting that we're up to 12 teams. They're playing 12 games and a lot of competition and now local rivalries because the Browns are probably in the area that they should be a little bit closer to the teams that they play against the most.
And just like you mentioned, the Lions had the worst record, I think you said, in the Western Conference, Western Division. They did that because they traded away their starting quarterback, Bobby Lane, during the off season. And the following season, Otto Graham would announce his retirement at the end of the 55 season, and they would have the first losing record in their franchise history. It just shows you how important it is to have a really good quarterback.
Yeah, and as a Steelers fan, I know where Bobby Lane went, and the Steelers finished in last with Bobby Lane that first year. They had him too, and Buddy Parker, I believe, at the same time, the former Lions coach at the time. So those two guys didn't help the Steelers very much. Maybe they gave him another win or two, but still in the basement.
Well, it took the Lions a few more years to recover. Eventually, their defense made them a good team again because they were really had one of the best defenses in the game at that time. But it took them a while to recuperate after they lost Lane, just like it took the Browns a little while to recuperate after they lost Otto Graham.
Yeah, I mean Otto Graham. Amazing player. And I am so glad that the National Football League decided just recently, here in the last few weeks, to include the records of the AAFC, including the player records, team records, and now Otto Graham sits tied with Tom Brady for 7 championships of professional football, and it's recognized by the National Football League. So I think that's kind of cool to get him up on the pedestal where he should be with the elite quarterbacks.
Yeah, I believe when the NFL Network, it was either the NFL Network or one of the other sporting news, they selected their 100 greatest players of all time. I think that one of them had Otto Graham in the top 10. I think at number 7. And I know he was named to the NFL 100 all-time team when they chose that a couple of years ago. So he's definitely ranked as one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time.
Yeah, and it's I think it's part of his defactoring of not being considered, by the mainstream media and everything for so long, is because 4 of those years were a dominant AAFC performance where the Browns, like you said earlier, they whitewashed the competition in the AAFC, won it every year, 4 losses, and there was nobody even close to competing with them, and they brought that dominance over in the NFL, right out of the gate.
Well,
So
I think one of the reasons he fails to often get the credit he deserves is the fact that the NFL back in those days was predominantly a running league. And so the numbers, when you look at the numbers of these quarterbacks, they tell by comparison to even the numbers that in the 70s and 80s, because what the league leader in yards passing in those days would throw for maybe 1,800 yards. So you can't compare the numbers to what they do today, but it was a totally different game. If you look at his winning, his one-loss record, the number of times he led the league in a passing statistical category for passers, and you realize how good he really was.
Yeah, he definitely was, and had a couple good guys catching the ball too. And maybe you could talk a little bit about those guys.
Sure, well, I think prior to 55, I think the all-time AAFC leader in receptions and receiving yards was Matt Speedy. Um, he
That's
held
a
those
great
records.
name for a receiver, isn't it? Max
Yeah,
Speedy.
but I think by 55, you had Dante Lavelli, who was nicknamed Blue Fingers because he hardly ever dropped a pass, if ever. He was Otto Graham's favorite target most of the time in Cleveland. And they also had a speedy youngster named Ray Renfro, who spent his first few seasons shifting back and forth between running back and receiver. And he holds the all-time Browns record for most yards per reception. I think it's close to 20 yards per reception over the course of his career. Now, he didn't catch a tremendous number of passes. He would typically catch maybe 35, 40 passes a year. But most of them were from close to 20 yards or more. So they were the 2 top receivers on that team.
Yeah, that's great going there. And how about then back in the backfield with Otto Graham? Who was his running back at that time? Do you know?
I think they had a guy named Morrison and another guy named Modzelewski. I think Modzelewski might have been the brother of the Giants defensive tackle, Dick Modzelewski. I'm not that familiar with those 2 players because they didn't make my top 50 list, but they were the 2 starting running backs. And of course, 2 years later, they got Jim Brown. And then a year or 2 after that, they had Bobby Mitchell, who were,
Yeah.
they comprised one of the greatest backfields in the history of the NFL.
Yeah, that's for sure. So this might be the year or two span where they didn't have the high profile name that people recognize today, but still very good backs back in that era. Paul Brown didn't have any slackers back there handing the ball off by Otto Graham.
I think their offensive line, though, was probably the best in the league, though. I mean, at center, you had Frank Gatsky, a Hall of Fame center who I believe made a Pro Bowl and All Pro like five years in a row. You had at right tackle Mike McCormick, I believe it's Mike McCormick, yeah, who Paul Brown called the greatest offensive tackle he ever saw. And then you had someone at left tackle who people may remember more as a place kicker, earned the nickname the Toe during his career, but he was actually the first 10 or 12 years of his career a tremendous offensive lineman named Lou Groza. He was, I think, from Brown's inception in 1946 until the late 50s. He was a starting left tackle and a great one on that team. And then he eventually, as he got older, he transitioned to being strictly a place kicker, but he was a combination place kicker and offensive lineman his first 12 or 13 years in the league. And they also had a very good a left guard in Abe Gibron, who most people remember as the head coach for the Chicago Bears during the 1960s. But he was a multiple-time All-Pro and Pro Bowler with the Browns during the 50s. So they had a really good offensive line.
Yeah, that's so did any of those gentlemen you just mentioned, or did all of them, they make your top 50 Browns?
All of those four, yes. Gatsky and McCormack. Rosa made it into the top 10, and Gibran also made it into the top 50. Yeah, so Rosa was the highest rated of those four, but all four of them made it into the top 50.
Wow, that is tremendous. Well, as long as we're going back, talking about the top 50, tell us a little bit about this top 50 book that you have on the Browns. What can a reader expect when they go on and click our links and get to you at your book and purchase it? What can they expect in there?
Well, I formulated my rankings primarily based on the overall level of domination that each player attained during his years with the Browns. So to determine that, I looked at things like whether or not he ever won the league MVP award, whether or not he ever led the league in a major statistical category, how many Pro Bowls he made, how many All Pros times he made All Pro, and then I also looked at the overall influence he had on the team, how he impacted the fortunes of the team, whether or not he improved the way their fortunes during his years in Cleveland. Yeah, I looked at number, and sometimes it was difficult because you're comparing players from different years, so you have to weigh. Looking at the numbers, you have to weigh the year that they played in and comparing their numbers. But in addition to looking at the numbers, I just looked at the overall reputation they attained, they gathered in during their careers, what other players had to say about them, what coaches had to say about them. And I covered basically every year in Browns history. Obviously, the 50s and 60s had a lot of those plays because they were more successful during those years. But even in the 80s and 90s and up until now, they've always had at least a few great players on their team. Like right now, you have Myles Garrett. And in the more recent times, you had players like Joe Cribbs and Eric Metcalf, players like that.
Yeah, probably Ozzie Newsome, I'm sure is
Ozzie
probably in there.
Newsome,
Yeah,
yeah,
some.
you had the 60s, you had Leroy Kelly and Dick Shafrath. A little bit after, right, a short time after this 55 Browns, you had players like Gene Hickerson coming in and Jim Houston. So you had the 60s had a lot of outstanding players too.
Yeah, that's an interesting franchise. Now, I mean, I'm fortunate enough being in Erie, Pennsylvania. I'm 100 miles from Buffalo Stadium, Cleveland Stadium, and Pittsburgh Stadium, so I can get within an hour and a half to any of those three stadiums and get to watch them. And of course, being a Steelers fan, it's easier to get a ticket in Cleveland games most of the time than it is one in Pittsburgh. So I've been to quite a few games back at the old Cleveland Municipal when I was a kid. My dad would take me all the time. Matter of fact, the most prominent game there is I got to see when Terry Bradshaw got dumped by Turkey Jones in I think 76 season or 77 season, somewhere in there. I was like 9, 10 years old at the time, and but very memorable. And the Cleveland Municipal Stadium was very archaic, and it was almost it was almost like being what I imagine the Roman Colosseum must be like. I've never been there, but all cement and giant pillars in a way. And I always remember trying to watch a game, and you lose like 10 yards of the field because one of these giant pillars, if you're in the upper levels, is blocking your view. But good memories and good people there in Cleveland. We've always had a lot of fun going there.
Did you ever sit near the dog pound in Cleveland?
I never sat in a dog pound. I'm not brave enough to do that, especially at a Steelers game. But I have seen it from afar when I've been at some games. So yes, yeah, definitely a passionate fan base, and for everything that those folks have gone through, especially losing a franchise at one point, having some down seasons, they are still just as riled up and fiery, even in the bad times as they are in the good times. And it's good to see a passionate fan base like that.
And let's not forget them losing the AFC Championship game in back-to-back seasons to the Denver Broncos in terrible
Yeah.
fashion.
Yeah, that definitely was bad too. Probably not as bad as Liddell taking them to the Baltimore and Baltimore winning a championship shortly thereafter. But
Yeah.
they've been through some hard times. But we're in the good times. We're in the 50s. This is good times for Cleveland Browns fans and Cleveland fans in general because they're winning championships. I believe the Indians were pretty good back in that era too. Of course, the Indians seem like they always have some good teams. But yeah, so who else on this 55 team would you like to talk about?
We already discussed Len Ford and how dominant he was at right defensive end. They had Bob Gain, who was playing the middle guard position. He basically took over that position from Bill Willis after he left. Um, Gain spent most of his career at playing left tackle, but in that particular year, he was playing the middle guard position, which was very similar to the middle linebacker position today. And he was one of the he was very good against both the run and the pass. So he was a multiple time Pro Bowler. You had the other tackle, one of the other tackle positions, Don Colo, who was towards the end of his stint in Cleveland. He was a very effective run stuffer for the Browns in the middle of the defensive line. And they had as one of their linebackers a name that you'll be very familiar with as a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Chuck Noll was
Yeah.
one of the linebackers on that team. He was not
Okay.
as great a player as he was a coach, but he was a formative, pretty good player, a starting linebacker. And they also had another future NFL coach, Walt Michaels. He played all three linebacker positions at different times. And that year, I believe he was playing. I'm not sure which linebacker position he was at that year, but he played all three at different times. He later became a long-time defensive coordinator and actually became a head coach of the Jets later on in his coaching career. And their defensive secondary featured three very solid players, one of whom made my top 50 list, Warren Lahr. He was playing cornerback that year. He spent his last couple of years in Cleveland at safety. If he slowed down a bit, but he placed second in team annals in both interceptions and interception return yards. So he was very effective. And they also had in their secondary Don Paul played one of the cornerback positions. They had a strong safety Ken Cons, who was another very solid defensive back to have. Their defense was pretty much loaded too.
Yeah, it's there's quite a few people you're mentioning there too. So that's you've got a good portion of the starting 22 you're calling out there. So you know they got to be good when you're talking about that many of these guys.
Almost half of them probably made my top 50. Yeah.
Yeah,
At
that's
least honorable mention at the very least.
yeah, that is amazing. Now, I mean, we must say, I told you earlier that the Rams had the best record over in the West. So these two teams are meeting for the championship of the National Football League. And they're going to play it this year because they're rotational. They're meeting out in the LA Coliseum on December 26th, day after Christmas. So this is one of the later times of the year that the NFL championship games are being played back then. We know now they're in February, but this is like a holiday tradition now. They're playing a day after Christmas. And the Browns,
Excuse me, they actually played the Rams twice in the NFL championship game. They lost to them in 51. And they came back and
that's
they beat them 3 years later.
that's right. That's right. And didn't they have
Or
another one?
4 years later. Excuse me.
Yeah, I think yeah they played them two times prior to that before this one, right? Did they
Uh,
play another one too? I'm trying to look
They
here.
beat them in
Maybe
52. They beat them in 50. I forget about it. I'm not sure about that.
I'm
They might have
looking
beat them
here.
in 50.
I'm going back. Yeah, 50 they beat the Rams,
All right. It's
and
3 times
so
actually.
yeah, so this is the third time they've met in the championship,
Ah,
and of course, as we've discussed on previous episodes of the series, the Rams are the previous Cleveland franchise. So till up till 1945 was their last season there. So this is kind of a cool thing when those two teams meet. But the Rams still have, they're still loaded too. They have Norm Van Brocklin, a Dutchman at quarterback. They are,
I
very.
believe Bob Waterfield had retired by then, right?
Yes, he had. He had really. They had that two quarterback system there for so long that worked so
Right.
well for them, and when you have coaches like previously Shaughnessy and Joe Stidahar and
I think
trying to
Crazy Legs Hirsch was on that team.
yeah Hirsch is on that team.
And the receiver, what's his name again?
Tom Fears.
Tom Fears, right.
But their coach in this 55 game is another legend. Sid Gilman is coaching the Rams. One of the greatest innovators of offense. Next to probably like Shaughnessy and Brown. Sid Gilman's up there because he's really bringing in some innovative things too. So
Was
really,
Willie Was Weeb Eubank one of the assistants on that team?
Um, I don't know. Let me just call them up and take a look here. Um, it's not really giving me the assistance on the page I'm here right
I know
now.
he was the head coach in '58 when they beat the Giants. So I'm pretty sure he was probably an assistant on that staff, but I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure if Weeb was with them at that time. But they're 8-3-1 record for the Rams. Their losses were they lost to the Bears twice that season and once at Green Bay, and they end up tying the very strong Baltimore Colts team at the time. So, pretty good record for them too. And with all their stars, this is a matchup made in heaven once again for the National Football League. They just love these games, and they were really getting some good matchups in their highlight game of the season. So,
Yeah, unfortunately, we were still 3 years away from the real growth of the league when the Giants played the Colts in what they call the greatest game ever played. So that I don't think this game was probably even televised. I could be wrong about that, but it may not even be televised.
I don't think it was. I don't think it wasn't nationally televised, but it was. I think there was a lot of local television because they had back earlier, a few years earlier, they had some spot games where they have some videos. So that's why there's video of it because they were televising some of these games. So
Yeah,
you go back and see some of these
it shows
championships.
you how little publicity the National Football League received in those days. I remember an episode. This is quite a few years after that. This is in the mid to late 1960s. There was a show called, I believe, I've Got a Secret, or
Mm.
Watch My Line. I'm watching one of those shows, and they had as their guest one time Ray Nitschke, and none of the people who were questioning knew who he was. I mean, now you recognize the face right away, but it was so underpublicized back in those days.
Yeah, college football and Major League Baseball were definitely king of the sports world back then. The NFL was
Boxing, and also
boxing.
thoroughbred horse racing were big back then
Yeah,
too.
that's true. So yeah, people really didn't appreciate the National Football League for what it was. Just an interesting thing. Attendance of this game in the LA Coliseum, a pretty big metropolitan area, and a lot of people in Southern California, and it's people want to go there. They had 85,000 for this game, so not too bad. That's comparable what today's games are. But prior to that, the games were 43,054 played in Cleveland. At Briggs Stadium in Detroit the year before that, it was 54,000, 50,000 at Cleveland 3 years prior. So they jumped up almost 30,000 people by attending the game by going to a more pleasant weather and being in a little bit bigger area. LA was probably a little bit bigger than Cleveland at the time.
And you
So
mentioned of only about 50,000 people in Cleveland. When you consider that municipal stadium held, I think, was close to 80,000 people. That's really not a lot.
right. And it really wasn't appreciated, but I'm sure they get more than 50,000 for a Browns game, even during the 0-16 season. I'm sure they got more than 50,000 in attendance at Cleveland, whatever their stadium was called back a few years ago when they had that bad season. So that just shows you how much popularity the NFL grew. But it really was some of these games here with these high profile players that we appreciate more today than they did at the time, like you mentioned earlier. It got us up to that 58 game with your Giants and the Colts. That was a milestone moment for the NFL and really put them on a great trajectory to become America's number one sport, now going around the world as one of the top sports.
Yeah, I think after that '58 game, the networks decided to televise National Football League weekly. And during the '60s is when the game really exploded. I remember watching a game every Sunday. And in fact, they used to have doubleheader games on all the time where you'd see like a 1 o'clock game, you'd have like the East Coast teams playing, and on 4 o'clock, you'd have like the Rams playing the 49ers or sort games like that going on.
Yeah,
And then you even had the other network showing the AFL games back then too. So you'd see the Raiders and the Chiefs or the Jets, things like that playing on NBC.
yeah, that's amazing, and all that was the building blocks to get us to where we are today with the behemoth of the NFL, billion-dollar industry or multi-billion-dollar industry that's just really dominating television. It's affected the advertisers, with now a lot of gambling sites are doing, which is kind of interesting in itself. And
I
back
think
in this
gambling. I think gambling is one of the things that makes the game so popular, though. You get right down to it. a lot of people watch, I think, because they have money riding on the games, or they're in fantasy football leagues or whatever. And I think that has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, I was reading something not too long ago, and they were talking about, and if you remember back in the 70s and the 60s, the major advertisers for the National Football League were cigarettes, hard liquor, and not so much beer. Beer sort of came in after the cigarettes were phased out when the government wouldn't allow them to
Shaving
advertise.
cream,
I'm
shaving
sorry.
lotion, shaving lotion,
Yeah, yeah, shaving lotion,
and
and
commercials for
even
eczema. Are you around?
yeah, and even Joe Namath wearing pantyhose was a big
Right,
commercial back then. But
right.
now it's sort of shifted, and you still have the beer commercials. You have some of the other ones, but now it's mainly DraftKings, FanDuel, and some of the other betting sites because I think fantasy football and gambling on teams has now become accepted and mainstream. And the NFL is making so much money on it, they're not going to deny it now, even though back in the 60s they're taking their premier players like Paul Hornig and Alex Karras and suspending them for a couple seasons. So interesting how it's turned around on that. But it all came from these games here in the 50s really moving the NFL up the ladder as far as the fan support.
In 55, you were only 10 years after the end of World War II, so you still had some guys playing the game who were World War II veterans.
Yeah,
And
that's
some of the guys on this team fought during World War II.
oh, do you have some of the names of the guys that
Um,
by chance?
I believe
That's
Otto
an
Graham was
interesting
in the
fact.
military. I don't know if he was playing football in the military or he was doing battle, but I think Otto Graham served during World War II. I think Dante Lavelli did. Um,
We know
not
Paul
sure.
Brown was coaching the up in the
Oh
Great
yes,
Lakes military. Yeah.
yes. Paul Brown was coaching then. I think Len Ford might have served in the military during World War II. I know Bill Willis did. He was no longer on this. He wasn't on this team, but I think I know he was in the military. Of course, one of the more famous players, not on this team, but one more notable figures who was in the service during World War II is Chuck McNair of the Eagles. I know he was serving in the military during World War II. Yeah, well, at least a handful of players who served in the military. By the way, another player we haven't mentioned who was on this team was a punter, Horace Gillum, who people who saw him punt say he was the greatest punter in the history of the league. He used to punt the ball so high and far that he had such control over his kicks that he would be able to tell the guys which way the ball was going to bounce. So he would tell them where to go on the field. And he
Yeah.
caught during his career, he caught 3 punts of more than 80 yards, which is pretty phenomenal when you think about it.
Yeah, that's phenomenal in any era. I think teams would love to have an 80-yard punter right now.
Yeah.
Maybe not in Dallas where you could hit the big TV screen in the middle of the field, but you probably can't get the height.
Well, I remember reading somewhere where one player said that he kicked the ball so high that one time he kicked it he kicked it so high that he lost the ball in the lights and he couldn't see it. It was coming down. So he was really a phenomenal punter.
Yeah, that is definitely that's a great weapon to have for a team, isn't it?
And he was with the team starting on their AFC days. I believe like
Oof,
the second or third year. He was one of the early black players signed by Paul Brown.
that's amazing. You can have a leg and last that long. Now you're a decade into your career and you're still booting a ball like that. That's great.
He was
Yeah.
towards the end of his career by this time, but he was still one of the better punters at this time.
Yeah, I didn't realize it, but kickers and kickers especially, probably punters are the same way. I didn't realize it that their legs sort of wear out. I had actually a gentleman that I grew up with on the show a couple years ago, Sean Conley, who he never was a mainstay on it as a kicker, but he was always like the one of the kickers in camp for multiple National Football League teams over a few seasons, and he was a walk on it for the Pitt Panthers and was their starting kicker for in the 90s. And he told me that that's what happened with his career. That's why they bring in an extra leg into camps for the NFL right now. And in preseason games, your starting kickers not kicking all that often, and in practice, they definitely are. The starting kickers only want to kick, very few kicks in practice, where the other guys are kicking them because your leg wears out. And which I never realized. I've always thought their leg would get stronger and they're kicking almost like a soccer player. You just keep kicking the ball. But I guess there's something in their muscles or ligaments. I don't know exactly what it is, but eventually you burn your leg out and you can't kick anymore, which I found kind of interesting. So that's why I think it's amazing now that I know that, to hear guys still being successful a decade into their career kicking or punting the ball.
But think at some point they'd at least pull a hamstring or something. I mean, the way they're
Yeah.
extending those legs.
Yeah, I don't know. Actually, Sean now is he's down in Pittsburgh, and he owns aerobic studios and yoga studios to help people with their muscle tone and everything, which is kind of interesting too. I think that was what spawned him into doing that, to have the healthy bodies, and try to take care of your bodies and your muscles. So good for him that he found that through his football career. Now, I guess getting into this game, this championship game we were talking about, Cleveland went up 3-0 early in the game off of Groza's kick in the first quarter. And then Cleveland scores a touchdown again. They're up 10-0 before the Rams come back and battle back to make it a 10-7 game. But right near the end of the first half, Van Brocklin throws an interception, and the Browns return it to midfield. And the next play, Otto Graham hooks up with Lavelli for a 50-yard touchdown to basically end the half, and the Browns are up 17-7. So that's kind of a big number to go into halftime, and the LA crowd had to be beating their chairs a little bit after that, to have it such a close game, but to give away a touchdown right at the end of the half. And the Browns came out in the third quarter, scored 2 quick touchdowns to go way up. And then they trade touchdowns in the fourth quarter, the two teams, for a 38-14 victory for the Cleveland Browns at LA. So pretty amazing stuff there for the Browns to show their dominance over the next best team in the National Football League.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty one-sided victory for 24 points. I'm
Yeah.
sure that the point spread wasn't that big.
No, I'm sure it wasn't. I don't have that statistic, but it is pretty amazing. Oh, you know what? I just see here too, we were talking about television. NBC had the rights to televise this game, so it was nationally broadcast in
Okay.
1955. So that's kind of interesting. I didn't realize that at the time. So our listeners are probably already typing their emails out to me. So don't worry, we got it right here eventually. But thank you for the email. Send them in anyway. pigskindispatch@gmail.com. So, Bob, you said you have other books, besides your Cleveland Browns book. What are some of the ones that football fans that are listening to this podcast might be interested in?
Let's see. I did a 50 greatest players in New York Giants football history. I did one on the Dallas Cowboys. I did one on the Philadelphia Eagles, uh, Pittsburgh Steelers, Buffalo Bills,
Nice.
um, New England Patriots,
That,
Cincinnati Bengals,
you're covering a good portion of the NFL there. That's
the San Francisco 49ers. I plan on doing in the future books on the Jets and Dolphins, but those are on hold for a while. I'm working on. I have a Detroit Lions, 50 Greatest Detroit Lions book coming out later this year, right around the start of the next football season. I do Minnesota Vikings, Chicago Bears, Green Bay Packers. So I've completed that division.
yeah.
I may eventually get to doing one on Washington Redskins, Commanders, whatever you want to call them. I may eventually get to one on them, but still a handful of teams I haven't done. I'm doing more the historical, the older teams. I'm not doing teams like the Baltimore Ravens or
Okay.
yeah. I might do one on the Saints and Seahawks eventually, but I put to the forefront the more historic teams, more iconic franchises.
Yeah, that's a great era. It's underappreciated. These older things. The modern fan loves the modern players, which we do too. But you got to appreciate these guys in the past, like we alluded to earlier. They set the stage and were the building blocks to get these guys, these multimillionaires now that are coming out and haven't even played a game and just came out of our most recent draft, to be to that point when these guys are working 2 or 3 jobs in the off season, and then playing football basically for fun and a few $1,000s on game day. So
And personally, if I was a younger fan, I think I'd be more interested in learning about the older players because it's more that I don't know about them. So like when I'm doing my research, I mean, I've basically watched the game for the last 50 plus years, 50, 55 years. So I've seen most of those players play. But when I do my research, I mean, I've heard of some of the names of the older great players, like people like in this book, Len Ford and Otto Graham, but I never saw them play. So when I do my research on them, I find that more interesting. I'm learning things that I didn't know before necessarily.
You are preaching to the choir here. Pigskin Dispatch and our fan base, they're very smart, and we get to talk to a lot of folks about that in this evergreen history of the National Football League, college football, and some of the other rival leagues, AAFCs and AFLs, multiple AFLs over time, have really provided some great players to talk about with some great information, and gives you some good fodder to put in your books. Lets me have some great stuff too to put in some of my books, writing a little bit older professional football, but and college football. But all the same, we want to recognize these players and preserve the history. And we really appreciate you doing that in your books, and today coming on here and talking about this great Browns team and some of these awesome players that played for the Cleveland Browns.
Well, thank you so much for having me. By the way, anyone who's interested in any of my other books, you can find them all on Amazon or BarnesandNoble.com. I look up the name Robert W. Cohen, or just look up for the title, and you'll find them there. And any future books will be available in bookstores.
All right. Well, Bob, we really appreciate you joining us today. And folks, like we said, we will have links to get to Bob, at least get to his Amazon authors page. So you can see all the other great stuff he has there, including this 1950s, top 50 players of the Cleveland Browns. And many of them were on this 55 team that we talked about tonight. So Bob, thanks for being a part of our series on National Football League championships, pre-Super Bowl, and for preserving that football history.
Thank you for having me, Darren. I enjoyed it very much.
That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.